everything, lots of telling, lots of organizing, lots of entertaining, lots of managing. And we were wondering what the effect of that would be, whether those kids would be coming back into school with a kind of greater sense of dependency or reliance on other people. Then there might be other kids who've had the opposite of that from their parents, who've been sort of neglected or disinterested, or maybe some parents didn't feel equipped or didn't feel able to take on the role of teacher. And some of those kids might have sort of floundered unprofitably, like, they won't have known what to do in order to manage and organize interesting, challenging, adventurous, time-regulated things for themselves. And others will have risen to the challenge. Others will have had, I don't know, what we would call, already quite strong learning dispositions there. They know how to organize their time. They've organized a space in their bedrooms to study. They know what time of day they study best. They can set up their own schedules. They can know when they're tired and when they need a break. And they might come back to school because they've had this less regulated time, even more powerful and independent as learners. So the question that we posed ourselves was, how on earth are teachers going to cope with kids who've had these different kinds of experiences, and also the kinds of experiences that the teachers themselves have had, and what they've been thinking about and what they will come back with. And the other bit of the question was, just suppose that the COVID goes away and then comes back with a vengeance in a year's time. Are there things that we could do now, that we could have in our minds, that will help all kids be, whatever their backgrounds or their circumstances or their parents, would be better able to make productive and entertaining use of their time than they did this time? So that's what's been going around in my head. What's going around in your head, Kath?
Well, very similar things. I think, that notion of lockdown ready is so interesting. So I think when I thought about that, because you raised that question with me, right, when we were speaking about this, and I thought, that's a nice one. And I was actually thinking about it again on my walk today and thinking, now, what do I actually think of when I think of that? And I think, well, this was a situation where all of a sudden, without too much warning, and in some cases, it was almost instantaneous, kids suddenly not coming to school, at home, having to do their learning at home. And for many kids, not all, it very much depended on how the school coped. And I sound like I'm speaking in the past tense, partly because in Australia, almost all of our schools have returned or have partially returned. So we're now starting to talk about this as something that was rather than something that is. But regardless, depending on how the school managed it, there were, for many children, suddenly, as you say, this moment where they were being less directed, where there was possibly less support. And I'm going to say this was not the case for all kids. Some it was, initially it was almost worse, I think. Regardless though, with this situation, what does it mean to be ready for that? Well, it means the things that you talk so much about, Guy, in your work, being how resourceful were they? How resilient were they? How adaptable and agile were they and their families? And indeed, that's been true of teachers too. As I was walking today, I was thinking, because I've been doing a bit of reflecting with kids and teachers over the last few days, and actually it's been an overwhelmingly positive experience for so many of them. And then I thought, actually, I think I'm in a bit of a bubble. So I feel like I need to make a disclaimer at the beginning of this conversation that all of the examples and the reflections that I've gathered from this experience have, for the most part, been with schools that I'm privileged to work with on an ongoing basis. So I guess for a long time, we've been kind of championing this idea of growing, and I'm going to use your beautiful phrase that I love and use all the time, really building our learning muscles so that in fact we can do it more independently. I'm curious about kids that have not been in these kinds of schools and have not had this kind of approach. I wonder how lockdown ready they were.
Yeah. And whether, I mean, it would be, from our point of view, I guess yours and certainly mine, it would be a shame if everybody was kind of reinstated old school without thinking about what's happened in the interim and what opportunities have arisen. I don't know if part of your deliberations, Kath, have been around about how teachers might be seeing this as an opportunity to what? Opportunity to fulfill their own visions of education more fully, maybe. What do you think?
I think for some, yes, but I think there's something about the unexpectedness of this. There was something about being thrown into it quite quickly that meant some of the learning and the growth for the teachers that I've worked with has almost happened retrospectively. It's been this, metaphorically being thrown into the deep end and then actually realizing something that was initially this, how are we going to do this? This is awful. This isn't going to be like school. Oh my goodness, we just got to get through this and we can't wait to get to the other side. Many of the teachers I'm speaking with, and I bet that, there are teachers out there that are thinking this too. I've had conversations with teachers over the last few days where they've said, you know what, there were things about this experience that were absolutely beautiful as a teacher. I wasn't expecting it, or I didn't know that I was missing that in my practice, or I've reconnected with that part of me as a teacher that I'd forgotten or had got buried in the quagmire of assessment expectations and so on. So perhaps it wasn't so much about, for many of us, it wasn't so much about, oh, now I get the chance to do what I've always wanted to do, but almost by default, now I'm thinking about some ways that I want to continue to be. And I know I'm sounding a bit Pollyanna about it. And again, I have to keep framing this around the conversations I'm having with teachers that I think were perhaps a little more ready.
Yeah, if you try and imagine what's going on outside the bubble, how optimistic do you feel about, this might provide a chink of an opportunity for a greater expansion or a greater realization of the kinds of education that you and I value so highly?
I feel like both of you are reading the minds of the participants right now, because that's exactly what's going on in the chat right now.
Yeah.
They're talking about how do we bring this learning with us to move forward? The opportunities, what would be the big learnings that we need to actually get the momentum to keep it going? Kath, the last time we spoke, you gave the statement, which I absolutely loved, and you stated, how do we go forward with the gold that we mined from this experience? And there seems to be a common thread right now in the chat. So how would you respond to it? How do we move this forward with this big learning?
Well, I actually just posted a blog with that title today, because I've spent 3 days with 3 different schools mining for gold, trying to look at what were the things. I mean, it would be easy to mine for, what's the opposite of gold? Oh, I can't sustain the metaphor. Anyway, yeah, there we go. Mind you, dirt's good. Anyway, you can grow things in dirt. So see, it doesn't work, does it? But it's been easy to talk about the hard things.
Dross is the word.
Thank you, Guy. So we could have mined for dross. We've done that a lot just in our regular conversations. This was a deliberate, let's look at the things that have been promising and interesting and valuable and better? What's been better? It's a really interesting question, because I think for many of us, myself included, I don't know that I would have imagined that there would have been many things that were better. But it's been interesting pondering that. And then we've identified several of those things. And now we are faced with that question. All schools are, many of the people listening to this are, you know, how do we stop ourselves from, I'm going to use a phrase that I heard Alan Luke use many, many years ago at a conference, and he talked about the lure of home, you know, that we go out on this adventure and we discover some new things, but, you know, in the end, we want to go home. And in Australia, our remote learning time actually hasn't been that long. So my answer to that question is, I'm not sure, you know, if we're talking about this notion of building habits, that we want to change some habits. So there's been some things that have perhaps not quite become habit, perhaps with a longer period of time they might. But I don't know. How do we help ourselves? So I'm going to just use one example, and then I'm going to shut up. But one example that I've heard over and over and over again is people talking about just being able to go slow. More pauses, a more deliberate, slower pace, kids having more breaks, that there's been, you know, unless they've, and a few people, of course, we all made the mistake initially of thinking we're going to try and replicate the school day. And once we realised what the hell are we doing, that goes out the window. And then we've had less content, more time, a slower pace, a more forgiving pace. And so many people have said, not just in school, actually, that's been the thing about people's lives outside of school. It's like, how do we stop ourselves from getting back on that hamster wheel and things speeding up again? Have we spent long enough for it to become a habit?
Yeah. I don't know. I veer between optimism and pessimism about that. And I guess it's going to be very different in different places. Yeah. But I think as certainly in my country, in England, the schools aren't back yet. But if I could wave a magic wand and plant a strong seed in the mind of every school principal as they think about reuniting with their staff and opening the doors, it would be to start back with an open conversation about what's this been like, what's been good for you, what's been bad for you, what have you been thinking, what have you been realizing. And I think you have to start that conversation in the way that I guess you have been doing over the last few days, facilitating those conversations with schools. But I would love all schools to kind of to live with that question of, you know, what's been, to do an appreciative inquiry on the lockdown and say, you know, what, it's been tough, it's been anxiety making, there have been uncertainties and frustrations and disappointments and disagreements, but are there things that we can pan, like the gold, that we can pan out of that? And then, I mean, I think the teachers should try and live as long as possible with that question. I've always remembered a long time ago, I heard someone say in a meeting, I don't know what it was, that I thought it was a bit twee at the time, but I think there's something interesting in it, was she said at her home, she and her husband had a big, it wasn't a fridge magnet, but a big sign on their fridge that said, it was just a big question, which was, what is it to be married? And I think something like to live with a big question like that for as long as possible. What is it to be a good learner? What is it to optimize education? But then I think I would love, if I could rule the world, that very quickly the children would be involved in that conversation.
That's it.
So what did they find anxiety making, problematic, the levels of freedom or autonomy that they couldn't cope with? Do they have ideas about how they could, you know, if we do the What about next time? Are they lockdown ready for the next time when COVID-22 comes back to bite us in the bum?
Yeah.
What do the children, what would they like, children and students, like us to be doing with them, to them, for them? What would they like us to, our schools to be laying on, so that they felt readier to make maximal use, to engage optimally with that degree of freedom when it happened again? So I think keep sparking that conversation. I would want all school principals to be the prime custodian of that big question and not to foreclose on it too quickly. I don't know what you think about that.
Oh, look, I couldn't agree more. And I just feel so, overused word, but I feel really privileged that, you know, principals that I work with, you know, principals like Chris Reed and Zoe and Manuela, that have actually invited me in to do that appreciative inquiry for that very reason, and have all, you know, part of that process is now mining for gold with the children. So we've done it with the teachers, and now I'm sure, Nancy, you've probably been having similar conversations in your school, because and we can't leave it too late. And I'm actually doing it with parents. When am I doing it? Tomorrow. So I think it's not just asking teachers, it's not just asking the children, it's also asking the community, it's asking the parents. What did you notice? You know, what did you notice? What worked? How did this strengthen you? I mean, we've had parents talk about understanding, you know, a few parents saying, now we get what you've been talking about with this inquiry thing. Now we get it.
Right.
Oh, now we get that language. And, you know, we've certainly put a few things in place to assist with that, but it's such a great, you know, what did you learn about your children? What did they learn about you? And that conversation, if it's beautiful to do it, it's beautiful to get the gold, but we also need to use it. So the principals, going back to your comment about leaders, I think that if the leaders in our schools, then the next step for me would be about a really strong culture of permission, and that permission to say, right, if this is what we have considered to be highly valuable in this experience, what might that mean for ways we tweak, change, let go, modify, disrupt the way we've been doing things? And I want you to choose something. So if I was the boss of the world instead of you, Guy, I would be saying, or we could just swap. You can be the boss on Monday, I'll be the boss on Tuesday. But I'd be saying, you know.
No, I want to do a kind of parallel job share with you.
Yeah, okay, no, fair enough. Yeah, 50-50. All right.
Okay.
But it would be saying, and this is certainly something I know that so many principals will be offering, you know, please, this is your time to play. It's your time to inquire. Interesting, in Australia now, we've got this kind of 5-week period between now and the end of term. And it offers us, and in some states, they've reduced the expectations around reporting and assessment. So it's like this gift. It's like, right, try something. Right? Many kids have loved having more control, for example, over the way their day might look, their learning day. Not complete, you know, I'm just going to do what I like, none of it, but actually having some autonomy over when they might carry out certain tasks and so on, the organisation of their day. That's a perfect one to say, right, that really worked for some of you. How might we help you have more of that autonomy here at school? What might that look like? Let's play. Yeah. Let's see what happens. Let's inquire. Yeah. So we all enter with this lovely spirit of investigation and inquiry, and we recognise the learning muscles that we've built, and we don't let them atrophy. You know, we keep working them out. We keep keep
exercising.
Yeah.
I was wondering to go back to where we started this conversation, Kath. Whether, I mean, this is far too crude, but let's just say When the kids come back to school, there'll be all kinds, but let's just say there are those who've been floundering and those who've been flourishing.
Yep.
How do we get the children to self-organize so that the flourishers can share some of whatever it was that enabled them to flourish with the kids who didn't have such a good experience, who for whatever reason either didn't have the opportunity or didn't have the courage or didn't have the knowledge to grasp the autonomy that they had and make it purposeful. I'm thinking about, as I'm talking, I'm thinking about the research on some of the more radical progressive schools where there was an awful, like Summerhill in England, for example, where there was a huge amount of autonomy. You didn't have to go to lessons, you didn't have to do that and the other. And when the researchers came in to have a look at this, I mean, it was a lot of individual differences. But one of the themes was that some kids were ready to manage and handle this degree of freedom and autonomy, and other kids weren't. So it's like, how do we organize a school so that it grows everybody towards autonomy? And those who are a bit, this is going to beginning to sound a bit elitist, but those who are kind of more autonomy ready are able to somehow be mentors or coaches. And I'm thinking of 5-year-olds or 17-year-olds as well as teachers to help along other children who are more timid and less able to grasp the opportunities of adventure which the world is going to throw at them. I don't know whether that was a question or not, or just a ramble.
Well, there's a strategy inside your ramble, and inside, not that it was a ramble, Guy, forgive me, there was not at all, I would never. But there's a strategy in there already, isn't there? There's an approach, and what you're arguing is that it's about recognizing the strengths in different children and allowing those strengths to be a source of support for each other. Because I'm going to say that what we might, and the crude categorization there, the flounderers, sure, they might be floundering around things like autonomy, for example, but perhaps they're flourishes in other areas.
Sure.
So
absolutely.
doesn't it come down then to, again, the capacity of, I'm going to put a bit of responsibility here on the teacher's shoulder, because for me, it's the teacher recognizing, firstly, it's really knowing those kids. And my goodness, some teachers have said to me that they've got to know their kids as people beyond just their children as learners through this in ways they never have before. And perhaps by tuning in much more intensively to who are these people that I'm engaging with on a daily basis? What are the strengths that we can see in each other, and how might we help each other? And now I'm sounding Pollyanna again, but I think there's something about recognizing what are the gifts we each bring to the community. And then let's match up. So really, and this comes back down to our identity as teachers, doesn't it? That this letting go of, I don't need to be the one to teach you all. There's lots of teachers in this room. And then that's dependent on the time you allow yourself as a teacher to come to know the children. And that's dependent on less talking, more listening, observation, connection with families, that permission to make relationships and connection with individuals your primary focus, particularly in the early phase of the year.
Interesting. That one of the things that we were going to talk about was sort of similarities and differences between our two approaches, between inquiry and the learning power approach.
Because right now the chat is acknowledging your expertise, and I just sent them the link of all your resources. So all your books and your, and it was mentioned, someone was asking, someone wrote, does Kath and Guy always get along? I'm going to put that in a different way.
We're going to try and fall out.
We'll try and have a fight.
So
yeah.
let's. So I guess I'll ask you. You know, Guy has the learning power approach, and Kath, your inquiry base. So how do you see helping within your approaches? How are they compatible in terms of supporting teachers and students with being lockdown ready? Knowing
yeah. If I can dive in with that, because it's what I was thinking while Kath was talking, which was one of the things that's always been very central to building learning power, or the learning power approach, is to have a rich vocabulary for thinking and talking about learning, about the process of learning, and also about the dispositions or the habits of mind of being, in my language, a powerful learner. And as Kath was talking about, you know, we all have strengths and we all have areas of growth. I think it's really, really useful, and I'm reaffirming my commitment to the vocabulary of learning, what we sometimes call playfully talking learnish. And how important that is. And I was remembering a school that I worked with, a primary school that I worked with, many years ago, in Peterborough in England. And I was lucky enough when I made a visit to that school to sit in on the inaugural meeting of the student senior leadership team, which was a group of children whose job it was to advise the senior leadership team on how to make their school an ever more powerful incubator of learning for each other, to come up with those ideas. And the way that meeting kicked off was with all the children aged between about 7 and 10, who were the delegates. They'd been applied to be on this committee and had been interviewed and selected. And they introduced themselves through the way they'd been selected, which was they had to say, which of the learning muscles am I a role model of?
Beautiful.
So I live and breathe empathy. There was a child who had a very complicated home life, and had come into school specially for this day. He was often out of school, but he was acknowledged. He was on the team, on that committee, because everybody acknowledged him to be an outstanding empathizer. He knew how other children were feeling. And someone else said, you know, I'm a really good persister and I can help other people, you know, stick with it when the going gets tough. Not only that, though, they also had to say which learning muscle they were working on. So that language of growing the muscles, and of school being a place where you go to grow the muscles that add up to a healthy learning body, a healthy learning organism, was just very impressive. And you'll have had this experience loads. Very impressive hearing children talk with genuine fluency and understanding about the nature of learning and about themselves as learners. And it just, what you were just saying struck me as a great opportunity for that. Whereas here comes a little, maybe Kath and Guy falling out. I don't know whether you've, in your inquiry approach, how much do you stress the importance of that vocabulary, or do you let it happen more organically?
Oh, no. Nothing organic about the work I do. It's very intentional and deliberate. So such a suggestion, I'm offended. And I'm hoping that I'm waiting to see some of my teachers say, no, she talks about it all the time. There you go. Thank you, Belle. But I'm going to say, and so I'm sorry, people, but as much as we're going to try and have conflict, I just can't do it, because what I want to say is that actually it was the work of people like Guy, and I've shared this with many people, way back, it was actually the habits of mind work first that gave me this moment, because I think there certainly was, in the early days of inquiry-based learning, it was much more about the process that we go through in order to investigate these big questions and et cetera, et cetera. Really lovely, and some strong learning happened, but we didn't, I would say, in that early work in the late 80s and early 90s, we didn't position the process anywhere near as much as we do now around what we are learning about learning while we are doing this inquiry. For me, that was a wake up, and that was a long time ago, but it was a real wake up. And it's interesting, you know, I still have sort of slightly yellowing papers in my attic, which are my old units of work. And these historical artifacts show sort of lists down the side of kind of all the right words, but they were just sort of a reference to some generic skills that we were covering. And it wasn't an intentional, deliberate, explicit part of the process. I would now say that the inquiries in which the students and teachers I work with, the inquiries that we embark upon are as much about inquiring into how learning works and what we are learning about learning while we're inquiring as they are about. So this, you know, and that lovely metaphor you have of the split screen's been really helpful there. I would argue though, so here's my attempt, maybe I can get a little bit of a rise out of you with this one. I would argue that sometimes the work that we might do around, whether it's character strengths, dispositions, habits of mind, whatever framework we might use, that sometimes if we err too much on the side of let's build the language, let's get the words on the wall, let's talk about it, let's notice it and name it and all of that, it can become, it starts to lose its value, because in the end, we develop those muscles because we want to do good work in the world. We want to be good people. We want to be strong learners, and we want to make a difference. So I think the sweetest kind of, the sweet spot is when we are highly explicit about understanding where the learning that's happening, and at the same time we are engaging in questions and challenges of significance, projects of significance and worth. And when you've got the two working together, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. It all ought to, and I've sort of come at this from the opposite direction. I think we overdid the language, certainly in the early days of building learning power, and people got too hung up on, you know, the 4 R's of resilience, resourcefulness, reciprocity, and whatever the fourth one was. And you know, and the kids could parrot them back. It's like multiple intelligences. I mean, a lot of good innovations end up disappearing up their own linguistic backside. People just sort of learn to parrot the language, don't
Someone write that down. Someone grab that quote. That's the headline.
So now I think I'm not going to pursue that metaphor. So now I am much more, I think the language, that's why I used the word organic when I was talking to you before, because I like organic. I think that there is some value, there's a balance, there's a tension between picking out the learning muscles and identifying them and naming them. But the goal, exactly as you're saying, is to put them all back together again so that they become a fully functioning body. And if you get too mesmerized by the language, it just becomes superficial. And it becomes too, you know, you spend all your time practicing your scales and never playing the sonata, never putting it all back together again. So I remember almost the first time that I was in a classroom with Becky Carlson, my co-author, who's also delightfully sitting in on this, and just observing the skillful way that she just casually introduced the language into the everyday, just the living, everyday, normal discourse of the classroom, rather than sticking up more bloody posters of the things, glossy posters of the 4Rs, and fetishizing them. Actually just sort of just gently infiltrating the linguistic milieu of the classroom. I'm getting a bit fancy now, aren't I?
You're getting very fancy, Guy. Goodness me.
Infiltrating the linguistic milieu.
We were hoping for a big, fight here, but finding
can't do it.
Very
impossible.
So
the love is too strong, Nancy.
You have to be stealthy.
Looking at the learners, my next question was going to talk about where are things that you think you have a conflict with, but we're actually seeing you more on the same mindset on how to support the learners. I mean, do you really see any conflict between your approaches? Because right now you really are embracing what the learners should be developing in terms of the skill.
There's only conflict if they're used poorly or they're misunderstood. They're actually beautifully aligned. I can't imagine using a strong inquiry-based approach with students without thinking very carefully about the weaving in of those dispositions into the process. And if they were, that would just be such a missing piece. And at the same time, I can't imagine simply focusing on the dispositions for their own sake without attaching them and working with something powerful and meaningful that we're inquiring into. But certainly, so it's not really conflict. It's just far less effective if they're not understood. And I'm actually noticing someone made a comment which I think is really lovely, and I think I got it right. It was something about hearing us do a bit of a I used to think, but now I think.
Yes.
I'm so glad that you're hearing that, folks, because if I, as an inquiry, someone who really my life's work has been in inquiry-based learning, if I'm not changing my thinking, growing my understanding, and I'm circling back to the very beginning of our conversation, really, having experiences.
Keeping the question open.
Absolutely. And saying, hang on a second, maybe I was wrong about that. This looks like it's going to work more. And that is the essence of being an inquiry-based educator. It's not about, can I use the cycle of inquiry with my students? It's a tiny little piece. It's actually about bringing that stance, isn't it? It's bringing, I think why teaching is such a fabulous profession, because you are, you've got this great hunger that is never quite satisfied. There's always something to learn. And I think that's what's been lovely about this time for so many teachers, is that maybe for some of them it's kind of awakened that hunger a little, or it's allowed us to ask. We've had to ask questions, haven't we? We've had to figure things out. We've had to be what Peter Johnson describes as figuring out kind of people. We've had to identify as figure-outerers, and our kids have seen us like that. Our kids have seen us going, oh God, sorry, kids, hang on, it's okay, miss, you just press that button there and you do that, and you're, oh, thank you, right, great. I have to remember that next time. So there's been this lovely vulnerability, hasn't there, about this time for us as teachers. Whoops, I'm starting to rant. I'm just going to stop. I'm not even answering a question, I'm just ranting. It's getting late. Shut up.
Right. Nancy, do you want to shut us up and let people ask some questions, or should we rant and ramble on more?
Because I was just thinking, you just have a group of people in the chat that are really agreeing and conferring with their heart what you're saying. But many of the comments about, we believe this, how do we get our parents to start getting this, to help students to realize how can they manage their own learning? Because there were so many questions in the chat about, we know this, Guy, we know this, but how do we get the parents to get this message that we have to manage, students need to manage their own learning from the context of the classroom. What advice would you give to everyone that's listening?
Who's going to start? Do you want to start on this one, Kath?
No, you can. I just ranted. It's your turn.
Oh, okay. Okay. Again, I think it's, I would say it's like the water on the stone. It's like take every opportunity to whatever, when parents come to pick their kids up from school, when you send a little letter home about lunch money or a school trip or whatever it might be, just start seeding all of those communications with little ideas and challenges and questions about how to make sure that that the school and the parents are not conspiring to produce snowflake children. I was talking to a group of parents the other day, and I said, we don't want snowflakes, we want rock cakes. Rock cakes is an old-fashioned type of English bun, right? We want kids who are more robust, more adventurous, and able to be cautious when necessary, but by default, more open-minded, more imaginative, more adventurous, more exploratory. So what are all the little things that we can do, the little shifts of language, the use of words like, Becky and a lot of you, just like using words like tricky. Do you want to do something tricky? Which suggests that challenge is interesting. It's not like, do you want to do something that you're going to fail at and feel stupid and miserable? No, it's, do you want to do something that's really going to push you and stretch you, and which is going to hold out the possibility of that deep glow of pride that comes when you do something that you didn't think you could. And I think we have to just keep remembering to use that language to counteract the dead, dull, instrumental language of NAPLAN and tests and grades and knowledge, all of which are here to stay, and we have to deal with all those things. But it's our job as educators to keep doing what I was talking before, like infiltrating learning-oriented ideas and practices into the language that we use. And it's a gradual but relentless thing that we need to do. There's no magic bullet here as there isn't anywhere else.
Yeah, I think it's such a great question. And I'm wondering whether for some of you out there, this experience of actually parents spending time, we've had kids say, we've certainly had some kids say, I'm so sick of my parents, I can't wait to get back to school. There's no doubt there's been a bit of that. But there's also been a lot of reflection by families on actually spending some time with each other and starting to see what their child is capable of. Look what you can do. And if we as teachers, and I think this is where the language comes in again, Guy, so if we're using something like Seesaw, or we're sending an email home, or we're making a phone call, and we are feeding back, noticing and naming to parents with an emphasis on those learning dispositions. If we are saying, I just wanted to let you know that, your child was so persistent during our maths workshop today. I watched her as she kept trying to figure something out, and she kept going, even though it was really challenging for her. Her persistence really paid off today. If we're getting feedback like that, and we're and the kids are, so we're using the language in our feedback. I would argue another way that we gradually, I agree, it's gradual, we gradually help parents understand the power of this approach to learning is that when we're thinking about the sorts of things we might invite children to do at home, and putting aside what we know about the impact of homework, but if kids are engaged in learning tasks at home, we've seen some really rich learning tasks that in themselves have been an education for the parents. So for example, using the garden or using the home itself as a context for learning, to help families start to identify that learning can happen anywhere, that this idea that school's the place where you do the learning and that's somehow separate from the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So I saw someone in the chat, I think it might have been you, Jill, saying something about it's got to be authentic. The more authentic tasks, and we've been wondering, part of our gold mining, what could we do that means we might design more projects and challenges and inquiries that really that invite family participation in some way, or connect with the community more, so that there is more of an opportunity then for people to see what this sort of learning looks like. And the third thing that I want to say, and I think it's really important, is if we want parents, if we want anybody to hear us, then we need to have established a relationship that means we feel safe and trusted, or they feel safe and what am I trying to say? That we've got good relationships. So many of the teachers I've been speaking with have said, in fact, I wrote it in the blog, I had a young teacher say to me a couple of weeks ago, it's just this one simple line, and it's really stuck with me, where she said, you know what? Because they were ringing parents every second day to check in on their kids. And she said, I'm not scared of the parents anymore. She's only in her second year, and she said, I used to be quite, they'd come to the door and I'd think, and she said, now we're on first name terms. I know them. I'm really looking forward to seeing them again. So investing in establishing relationships, and maybe thinking more about some of the things that I remember doing as a young teacher myself, when I felt like I had more time to do these things, going and having a meal with families. We used to do home visits when I taught 5-year-olds, but it did make all the difference. And then you've got this relationship that allows the messages that you want to give about learning to be heard.
Yeah. And I think I want to throw in one more thing as well, which is a particular bee in my bonnet at the moment, which is, and don't use jargon.
Yeah.
Use everyday, ordinary language. Talk about grappling with things. Talk about things being tricky. Do not talk to parents about growth mindset or metacognitive awareness or agency or self-regulation or any of that stuff. Have a thorough inventory and de-arsify your language before you go out and talk to parents, because otherwise it's just people in education hide behind this fancy phraseology. Growth mindset.
Did you say de-arsify?
Yeah, it's a good word, isn't it?
That's great. That's straight to the pool room, that one. I love it.
But it's like, growth mindset has run into the ground because it's become so misunderstood. And Carol Dweck keeps having to tell people, I didn't mean that.
Yeah.
And the whole millions of teachers have ended up with a fixed mindset about growth mindset, which is exactly what it was supposed not to be in the first place. So just be plain and simple. Talk about things being tricky. Engage with things that are uncertain or surprising with interest rather than trying to wrap them up. Live with manageable amounts of being puzzlement. Celebrate puzzlement, so that we can all live in puzzlement together and have fun exploring and finding out. Make your home like that. Make your classroom like that.
Yeah.
End of rant. We've only allowed time for one question so far. Come on, Nancy.
We're dreadful ranters.
I love the rant, though. It's so enthusiastic. It's so true, though. After a while, multisyllabic people, I'm like, I stay away from multisyllabic. It's not even a word. So we talked about the students, the teachers, the parents. Now, what does this mean in terms of a culture for a school? In terms of how do we contribute to the school-wide culture? In terms of inquiry, in terms of looking at the learner managing their own learning. How would you conclude today when looking at culture, shared values, shared language, in terms of what you discussed?
Okay, your turn, Kath.
I feel like I want to go back full circle again. I think I already came back to I'm going to go around again. And I think if we're talking culture, I want to say again, we have a perfect moment for rebooting culture right now, don't we? So grasp this moment. So if we want to look at an opportunity to revisit, what did this experience say? These are the questions I'd be asking. What did this experience say about our culture? What did we notice? What are some elements of the way we've done things, which is, you know, your classic definition of culture, the way we do things around here? How have we been doing things in this remote learning time that we've really valued? I've heard a lot of people talk about the cohesion and the true collaboration that they've experienced, and that lovely feeling of connectedness. How do we sustain that? So for me, it would be about taking a moment like the one we're in right now and harnessing that to ask that question. You know, what kind of place do we want to be?
Yeah, very good. And I would just like to add that I think, I mean, it's sort of topical to say that everyone's a leader in the school, but I think from the book, the fourth in the Learning Power Approach series book, which we just produced, is the book for school leaders. And one of the things that screams out of that is that culture change is not going to happen unless there is frequent, loud, heartfelt, visible endorsement of this direction of travel by the principal of the school. Otherwise, people think it's just another fad and it's going to blow over. And I think the world will change. The world is changed by brave principals, by school principals who understand that it's not, they don't live in an either or world. It's not either the whole child or NAPLAN. It's both. But who, having seen that, are brave enough, adventurous enough to bring the staff and the parents and the children with them and say, it's not just about results. It's about what we call results plus. And the plus is at least as important, if not more important, than the results. How are we going to do better? What's our 5-year plan? I will protect you from all other initiatives for 5 years, and we will live with this one question. And I would hope that school principals, when they come back, are fired up with that. You know, more of them are willing to be more brave about being open to the possibility that we can do a much better job, which embraces both knowledge and grades and character and learning power, that we can go for it all, and that it's important that we should.
Yeah. I love that, Guy. And I want to say that when we look at what we've just done, I think it shows just what we're capable of too. I hope that principals are looking at their staff right now and saying, wow, look what we can do. Look what we just did. So we've got that capacity to be so imaginative, creative, and responsive. It's exciting.
It is.
I really am being Pollyanna tonight, but anyway.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Positive way to bring closure to this webinar. First of all, with your expertise, the chat's going crazy with claps. So someone is saying we have to clap for you right now. So that's
thank you.
What really connects with everyone is your sincerity and your passion. It's so genuine. And you talk about the language that isn't the jargon. I think that's what really makes the connections that you have with people on an international scale. So thank you to, I think everyone is just saying, oh, well said, Nancy. Yay, thank you. Everyone's
thank you, Nancy.
And that's because of you too. You're so sincere and good people, but amazing educators that you motivate, you inspire others to say, after we leave, we're like, yes, I'm going to go out and do it. So thank you.
Oh, well, we feel very fortunate. I want to thank Chanel and Nancy. Thank you for your support. I mean, aren't we lucky? I mean,
Yeah.
I do feel incredibly lucky to be chatting with you, Guy, but to be in
pleasure.
a position that is so at the heart of what it means to be
Right.
human.
And to feel that we're part of, just seeing all the little comments flashing across my screen.
Yeah,
To feel that we're with family here. Yeah. It's good. I think it's, Chanel, can we do this every week, please?
No, I'm always ready, and I want to say thank you. I want to give my thank yous. Thank you all. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Kath. I couldn't have done this whole series without you guys, and thank you, Nancy.
Awesome.
That's all I can say. Thank you all, and thank you all for being here. We've had 400 people attending this.
Wow,
fantastic.
Yeah,
that is great. Thank you to the Australian teachers for staying up so late. I think there's even some New Zealand teachers staying up so late. It's bedtime for me.
Fantastic.
Portland.
Good.
Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Okay. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Bye-bye.